A Roman decree meant to free slaves was the very spark that ignited a 4-year war. In 104 BC, Sicily was a powder keg. Antaredion. The threat was not an invader, but a Roman promise of freedom, suddenly given and then betrayed. Soshurim. This is the forgotten story of 2 rebel kings and the shocking incompetence and treason of the Roman commanders who allowed them to rise. This crisis began not in Sicily, but far to the north in the year 104 BC. The Republic was facing an existential threat. The Cimbri, a massive Germanic tribe, were pushing south, heading for Italy, and Rome needed every soldier it could find. One of Rome's most famous figures, Gaius Marius, had been given command of the war against this northern menace. But Rome was perilously short of troops, prompting Marius to launch a massive recruitment campaign to face the enemy. His search for manpower extended beyond Italy to Rome's allies. Marius sent a request to King Nicomedes of Bithynia, asking for soldiers to bolster his legions. The king's reply was a diplomatic shock. Nicomedes stated that he had no men to send. The reason? Because so many of his people had been enslaved by the Romans themselves, seized for being unable to pay their taxes. This accusation struck a nerve in the Senate. It revealed a deep hypocrisy and a practical problem. Rome's own predatory practices were now hampering its ability to defend itself. The solution presented by the Senate was a pragmatic one, intended to solve the manpower crisis with Marius. They issued a formal decree. No citizen from a friendly, allied state of Rome could be held in slavery within the Republic. And yes, this senatorial order was dispatched to the provinces, and its effect was immediate. The news of this decree traveled quickly, eventually reaching the ears of Licinius Nerva, the propraetor or governor of Sicily. Sicily was an island that had already been shattered by a massive slave revolt nearly 3 decades prior, the First Servile War. The memory of that conflict, where tens of thousands had risen up, still lingered. Nerva, upon receiving the decree, acted at once.
Take word to the barracks. I want the cohort assembled by nightfall.
He began the process of manumission, and almost immediately he liberated some 800 slaves who hailed from allied nations. Single act, however, triggered a domino effect that the Senate had not anticipated. The liberation of a select few sent a powerful message to the entire slave population. It infuriated those slaves who were not from allied nations, who now felt their own bondage even more keenly. Simultaneously, it terrified the Roman nobles and wealthy landowners of Sicily, who saw their primary labor force about to vanish. These powerful aristocrats placed immense pressure on the governor.
We demand action now!
Nerva found himself with a rope around his neck, caught between the Senate's decree and the anger of the local elite. He made a fatal choice. Nerva decided to please the nobles and abruptly ceased the liberation process, refusing to free any more slaves. This reversal was the true spark of the war. For the slaves who had been promised freedom, this betrayal was more than they could bear. Seeing that their liberty was not going to be granted, a small group of about 180 slaves on the outskirts of Syracuse took up arms. They rebelled, seized a fortified position on a nearby hill, and prepared to fight. Soon as Nerva learned of this, he quickly gathered a contingent of soldiers and marched on the rebels. When he arrived, Nerva saw that he did not have nearly enough men to surround the fortified hill effectively. Fearing a defeat, he simply withdrew his forces, a sign of weakness that did not go unnoticed. But to make matters worse, Nerva's indecision had emboldened others. Another much larger group of slaves, this one numbering around 800, also rose up in rebellion, this time near the town of Heraclea. Second Servile War had begun in earnest, born from a broken promise. When Nerva heard news of this second, larger uprising, he directed his attention there immediately. He raced to the area, but the rebellion was moving faster than he was. By the time Nerva arrived, the rebel force had already swelled from 800 to 2,000 men. They were gaining strength by the hour as more and more desperate men flocked to their banner. Feeling overwhelmed, Nerva did not engage them himself. Instead, he ordered the commander of the local garrison at Enna, a man named Marcus Ticinius, to confront the slaves. Ticinius was given 600 of his men to put down a force that now numbered 2,000. It was a foolish order, sending a small detachment against a galvanized superior foe. Whoa! The first true clash of forces between the slaves and the Romans was about to begin, and it would be a disaster for Rome. The battle was brief and brutal. The forces under Ticinius were hopelessly outmatched, facing an enemy that outnumbered them by more than double. The rebels fought with a fury that the garrison soldiers could not withstand. In a rapid and humiliating confrontation, Ticinius and his forces were utterly defeated and fled the battlefield in a complete rout. Tobruk. This victory was a massive propaganda tool for the rebels. They had scattered a Roman-led force, and the news spread like wildfire. In just a few days, the number of rebellious slaves had exploded to more than 6,000. Shimar, they were no longer a mere band of fugitives, they were an army. Inspired by the memory of Eunice, the leader of the First War, the rebels sought a king of their own. They chose a man named Salvius, who was renowned among them for his prophecies and divinations. Salvius quickly proved to be a capable and charismatic leader.
What of the northern rearguard?
They are already engaged, General.
He organized this massive force, and soon he was able to gather a staggering army of 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. Maybe he had a real army, and he intended to use it. Without wasting a single moment, Salvius led his new force to attack the city of Morgantina, laying siege to it. While this was happening, Nerva had not been completely idle.
I want this legion ready for battle by tomorrow. Drill them harder!
He had finally recognized the scale of the crisis and managed to raise an army of his own, scraping together 10,000 men from the remaining garrisons and levies on the island. He marched immediately to try and relieve the siege of Morgantina. Salvius, in his haste to attack the city, had not expected such a rapid Roman response. He had focused the bulk of his forces on the siege, leaving his own camp almost entirely unprotected. Nerva arrived and saw the tactical error at once. He easily overran the rebel camp, dispatching the few guards left there and seizing all the supplies and plunder that Salvius had gathered. It was a clean, easy victory for Nerva. But it would not last. And when Salvius learned that Nerva had seized his camp, he made a bold decision. He immediately lifted the siege of Morgantina and turned his entire 20,000-man army to face his enemy. The two forces met on the field. Nerva had his 10,000 men and Salvius had his 20,000. Salvius took the initiative. He ordered his 2,000 cavalry to charge downhill, a thunderous assault aimed at flanking the smaller Roman force. The Romans, surprised and overwhelmed by the sheer impetus and fury of the rebel charge, barely offered any resistance. The line broke and Nerva's army was scattered. This victory was critically important for Salvius. It was not just a skirmish. He had defeated a Roman governor in an open field battle. It was now clear to all of Sicily that Salvius commanded a true army, one that could meet and beat a Roman force. Away, his legend grew, and his victory was compounded by events back at Morgantina. Following the battle, the slaves still inside the city betrayed the remaining defenders and opened the gates to Salvius, welcoming him as a liberator. Things were painting a very grim picture for the Romans in Sicily. They were about to get much, much worse. Just as Salvius was consolidating his power in the east, another massive revolt exploded in the western part of the island. This second uprising was led by a slave named Athenian. Athenion, who was reportedly a skilled warrior, was inspired by Salvius's victories.
Thousands captured.
He gathered his own army, a force of 10,000 men, many of whom also had experience in warfare. And with this new army, Athenion immediately laid siege to the well-fortified city of Lilybaeum. This, however, proved to be a mistake. The siege was a total failure, as the city was far too well fortified and provisioned to be taken by Athenian's new army. Athenian was forced to withdraw, a minor setback for the rebels, but a sign that they were not invincible. Back in the east, Salvius only grew stronger. His army continued to grow, attracting runaway slaves from every corner of the island. Soon reached the astonishing number of 30,000 men. He was the undisputed master of the eastern countryside. With this power, Salvius did not seek to crush his rival, Athenian. Instead, he sought to unify. He sent a summons to Athenian, calling the Western general to his side. Athenian, perhaps recognizing Salvius's superior numbers and prophetic authority, answered the call. He marched his best 3,000 armed men to join Salvius's host. In a crucial moment of unity, Athenian did exactly as Cleon had done with Eunice 3 decades earlier. He swore loyalty to Salvius and took on the role of his lead general. Source, the two separate rebellions had merged into one massive, unified kingdom of slaves. Together, they marched on the city of Triacala, a place known for its natural fortifications, and took it. There, Salvius proclaimed himself king and declared Triacala his royal capital. Ertudin, the news of this consolidated slave kingdom, with a capital and a 40,000-man army, sent a shockwave of panic through Rome. Senate finally understood that Nerva was hopelessly out of his depth. Ani the governor was replaced by Lucius Licinius Lucullus, who was sent to Sicily as the new propraetor. The Senate did not repeat Nerva's mistake of under-equipping his commander. Lucullus was assigned a considerable force, 14,000 Roman soldiers and 3,000 allied troops, a full army of 17,000 professional fighting men. When Salvius and Athenion learned of this new Roman army's arrival, they did not shy away. Confident in their overwhelming numbers, the rebel army of 40,000 men marched out from Triacala to meet the Romans, camping just over a kilometer away from the enemy. The stage was set for the largest battle of the war. Wester, the encounter between the two forces was chaotic from the start. It began with disorganized skirmishes, as units from both sides prodded and harassed each other, testing for weakness. But when the two main lines finally crashed into one another, the fighting became truly desperate and frenzied. Shirain, the professional discipline of Lucullus's legions, clashed with the sheer weight and fury of the rebel host. Casualties mounted by the thousands on both sides as the battle raged, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. The battle, and perhaps the entire war, hinged on a single moment. In the heart of the fighting, Athenion, leading his men from the front, was grievously wounded and knocked from his horse. Achaenon, the rebels fighting near him, saw their general fall. Believing Athenion to be dead, a wave of panic tore through their ranks. Fear was contagious. The rebel line, which had held firm through sheer courage, now broke completely. Soldiers began to flee in a disorganized rout. Salvius, seeing his army disintegrating and his co-commander down, knew the battle was lost. He realized there was no possibility of victory and fled the field as well. This battle was a devastating blow to the rebel cause. Lucullus had won a massive, if costly, victory. The half of the entire rebel army, some 20,000 men, had fallen in the battle and the subsequent rout. Ahon, it seemed the war was all but over. The remaining half, however, the 20,000 survivors, managed to flee back to their fortified capital of Triacala. A few days later, Lucullus marched his victorious army to the city, intending to put an end to the war once and for all. He laid siege to the rebel stronghold. But here, Lucullus's luck and his competence ran out. Cacturn. He launched several direct assaults on the city, but Triacala was, as reported, extremely well fortified. Each assault was beaten back by the desperate defenders. The Romans, having failed in every attempt to storm the walls, suffered heavy losses, and their morale began to fray. Conversely, the morale of the rebels, who had just seen their army shattered, began to recover. Granted, they had held their capital against a victorious Roman army. Lucullus, seeing he could not take the city by storm, was forced to withdraw from the walls and set up a static, long-term camp outside the city, effectively settling in for a long, grinding siege. So Remy, this did not sit well in Rome. Turskrai, the Senate, had sent Lucullus with a huge army. He had won a staggering victory, and now he was apparently incapable of delivering the final blow to a shattered, leaderless enemy hiding behind walls. Seeing his failure to end the war, the Senate decided to replace him. They appointed Gaius Servilius to take over the command. This decision would prove to be the most catastrophic mistake of the entire war. Lucullus viewed his replacement not as a tactical decision, but as an unjustified betrayal, a personal insult from the Senate. He had in his mind just slaughtered 20,000 enemies, and this was his reward. In a fit of unparalleled arrogance and rage, Lucullus decided to send a message to the Senate, one that would prove he was not the incompetent one. He gave a shocking order. His own Roman camp was to be burned to the ground. He commanded his men to destroy their own supplies, their equipment, and most critically, all of the siege engines they had built to assault Traiocala. His logic was twisted. He hoped that by leaving his successor with absolutely nothing, the Senate would understand that only he, Lucullus, had been capable of winning. In this, his plan worked perfectly. It was an act of high treason, one that would give the rebellion a new bloody life. Around this same time in the year 102 BC, Salvius, the rebel king, died of unknown causes within Traiocala. But the rebellion did not die with him. Athenian, who had survived his wounds from the battle, took full command of the rebel forces. When the new Roman commander, Gaius Servilius, arrived, he found no army, no camp, no supplies, and no siege engines. He was completely incapable of confronting Athenian. Athenian seized the opportunity that Lucullus's treason had given him. With Servilius paralyzed and the Roman military presence in Sicily effectively neutralized, Athenian led his armies out of Traiocala. He proceeded to ravage the island, overrunning the countryside and capturing even more villas and towns. He was not just rebuilding the rebel army, he was launching a new offensive. Therefore, despite the massive victory Lucullus had won just a year earlier, the situation for the Romans was just as bad, if not worse, than it had been under Nerva. The Senate was furious. They were done with the entire affair. Both Lucullus for his treason and Servilius for his incompetence were recalled to Rome, put on trial, and subsequently exiled. The rebellion in Sicily had reached a critical point. This was made all the more dangerous by the fact that Rome was still engaged in the desperate, large-scale war against the Cimbri in the north. The Republic was being threatened on two fronts. A drastic decision was finally made. Rome could no longer afford to send half measures or incompetent propraetors. The Senate authorized the consul himself, Manius Aquilius, to take command. He was given a full consular army, which meant some 20,000 elite infantry and 2,500 cavalry, likely diverted from the critical front against the Cimbri. And this was the full focused might of the Roman Republic. Athenian, however, was confident. His army had grown once more, now numbering 30,000 disciplined veteran soldiers who had defeated multiple Roman commanders. He trusted in his numbers and in the victories he had won. And so when Aquilius marched into Sicily, Athenian made his own fatal error. Instead of retreating to his fortress at Triocala, he decided to face the consular army on the open field. He was wrong. His army of slaves, hardened though they were, was ultimately no match for the experienced, elite, and professionally led forces of Manius Aquilius. The clash of forces was not the chaotic melee of the Battle of Lucullus. This time it was brief and it was a one-sided bloodbath. Hakoon, the rebel lines were systematically broken by the Roman legions. More than half of the slave army fell in the combat, a terrible slaughter that ended the rebellion as a field army. During that climactic battle, the two leaders found each other. Athenian, the slave king, and Aquilius, the Roman consul, engaged in personal combat. The rebel king managed to wound the consul, a final act of defiance. But Aquilius was the superior warrior, and he struck Athenian down, ending his life on the battlefield. With Athenian gone and his army shattered, the war was effectively over. Aquilius, though wounded, dedicated himself to hunting down every last pocket of resistance in Sicily. The final stand took place at the last rebel stronghold, where 1,000 surviving slaves had barricaded themselves inside. Look, they were surrounded, starving, and had no hope of escape. Sorry, Aquilius did not want to waste Roman lives in a final assault.
We can take the fortress by nightfall.
He sent emissaries to the rebels, offering them a grim bargain: surrender, and they would be given the honor of fighting wild beasts in the arenas back in Rome. The rebels inside the fortress considered this fate. Corinna's find. They decided that, after fighting for so long for their freedom, they would not provide a humiliating spectacle for their masters. Rather than face such a degrading destiny, the last 1,000 rebels decided to end their own lives. Don't be worried, this was the end of the Second Great Rebellion in the Roman Republic. It had been a conflict sparked by a broken promise, fueled by Roman incompetence, and prolonged by Roman treason. It would not, however, be the last. The Third Servile War was yet to come, and it would be the most important and ferocious of all, led by the mythical Spartacus. The seeds of this second great conflict were sown in the very soil of the first. For nearly 30 years, Sicily had known a tense, uneasy peace since the First Servile War had been brutally crushed. Hanno, the vast estates, the latifundia, were still worked by tens of thousands of slaves, and the memory of King Eunice and his general Cleon was a story told in whispers. The Roman landowners had grown complacent, believing the rebellion of the 130s BC was a unique event, a nightmare never to be repeated. They were wrong. The year 104 BC found Rome stretched thin, its attention fixed firmly on the northern horizon. Gaius Marius, a man of profound military talent, was tasked with stopping the Cimbri, a migrating horde that threatened to pour into the Italian peninsula itself. While his legions were seasoned, but they were not enough. The Republic's need for men was insatiable. This need drove Marius to look to the allied kingdoms on the periphery of the Roman world. His request to Nicomedes of Bithynia was standard procedure, a call for auxiliary troops from a client king. The reply from Nicomedes was anything but standard.